Welcome to the Maine Science Podcast. I'm Kate Dickerson. Today's episode is a conversation I recorded with Seth Benz. I've known Seth for a number of years, and our paths have often crossed at the Schoodic Institute's annual conference in the times before COVID altered the world. Seth's joy when he talks about education and birds is contagious, and it feels like I've been paying even more attention to bird calls since we spoke. I hope you find yourself as inspired to listen to the birds around you after listening to our conversation. All right, Seth, welcome to the Maine Science Podcast. I am delighted to have you here. We met each other again a couple of years ago at a conference. I called you the bird guy, right? I always think of birds. We can get into that, but that's a little tease for the audience. If you could just kind of give me as much background as you're comfortable with about how you got into science and then birds in particular, and then we'll talk about your work at Schoodic.
Well, thank you for having me, Kate. I really appreciate it. This is an honor to do this. I'm happy to do it. So I think, try to make a long story short, in the bird world, we talk about a spark bird, something that piqued your interest maybe when you were young or maybe when you were middle-aged or older, that got you into some sort of relationship with nature. And for me, that started when I was pretty young. My father was an outdoorsman, did a lot of hunting and fishing. And of course, as a young kid, I was anxious to go along anytime I was invited. And I remember maybe, I'm thinking age 5 or 6, where he'd take me on these trips, and he always had a buddy that he took along. And my task was to record the number of rabbits or pheasants. This was in eastern Pennsylvania, things like that. They encouraged me to write them down and keep track of how many things I was seeing on the drive. That's my first memory of collecting data, even though I didn't learn that kind of language until I was in college. So
I love that they had you at 5 or 6 doing this. Was that
that's my first memory of that? Yeah.
Was that to make the drive seem shorter, or just because? I mean, could have been any number of reasons, right? So.
Yeah, I think it was let's quiet the kid down, have him concentrate on something else while the two adults, had their whatever they were talking about in the driver and the passenger seat, right? So I was in the back and, happily at task. And every once in a while, they'd look over their shoulders. Did you see that? So that was my training.
That's awesome. So was your spark bird the pheasant, or was there something else?
Oh, no. The spark bird for me was a gray catbird. That was sort of the same time. I think I was actually 6. And my dad had me fishing out at a nearby lake where my grandparents lived. And we were walking down this trail, and this bird got really agitated. It was obvious that something was wrong. It started squawking and, all of this sort of stuff. And I put down the fishing rod and went toward it. And it sort of led me away from the path into this bush. And I remember sort of like, a kid, I just headlong into that bush too. And there was this amazing nest with 4 beautiful blue eggs. And it blew me away, and I was like, whoa, and my dad, I don't remember that he knew what it was, but from that day on, I remember that bird. And every time we went to that same place, at least in the summer, that catbird would be around. And that's my first memory of a bird that made some sort of impression on me.
So you were pretty young,
yeah,
which is fascinating. And you don't learn a lot about birds in school until college, and that's only if you pick it. So did you know that you wanted to learn more about birds, like from an academic point of view, or was it just a passion that you had and school filled in other blanks?
It was a passion that I had, but what happened for me, I grew up just south of a pretty famous hawk watching place called Hawk Mountain Sanctuary in Pennsylvania. And again, my father came home I guess it was in October one year. I think I was 9 or 10, and he had found a injured hawk and brought it home. And it had a drooping wing, so it couldn't return to the wild, although we didn't really know that. But he built a cage. We put it in our backyard and fed it all the wrong things, I would come to learn later. But one day, maybe a month or 2 or later, someone came to our house and said, hey, it's illegal to keep that hawk. You need to take it to Hawk Mountain Sanctuary. And so my dad packed me and the hawk up, and we went up to Hawk Mountain, and I got to meet the staff people there and saw some of the other birds that were in the rehabilitation. And I mean, that was just a huge impression as well. And on the drive home, my father said to me, wouldn't it be something if you could work at a place like that someday? This was a visit when I didn't really understand migration or any of that kind of stuff, except that in my hometown, when Canada geese were flying overhead and honking, our neighbors would run out into the street and look at this phenomenon. And I remember that too as being a young kid. So there was this kind of support. Back in those days, we kids were basically, the parents pushed us out the door and said, don't come in until dark.
I had that same upbringing.
And so, so there was a lot of time to be out there and be observant and look for turtles, frogs, snake, all that sort of stuff. It's very different than most kids are experiencing these days. Anyway, that trip to Hawk Mountain was seminal in my upbringing because in 7th grade, my school district took us to Hawk Mountain Sanctuary for a field trip. And so there I did get to see for the first time, we hiked up to the top of the mountain and birds were flying by. And so that was my first taste of that part of what the sanctuary was. And then when I got to college, I needed to do as an undergraduate, a senior thesis. And I went back to Hawk Mountain and asked them if I could come and study the hawk migration. And way back in 1976-ish, that was a novel idea. And they said, internship, what's that? I explained what I wanted to come and do. And they said, yeah, let's do it. What I'm proud of there is that internship was for them. I was kind of like a spark intern, if you will, because they've gone on to have an internationally famous internship program. And a year later, I was hired back to work there as a naturalist at Hawk Mountain after that internship experience. So for me, that was big time catalyst.
Did you study wildlife ecology in college?
I studied at that time it was environmental science, but I certainly erred on the side of zoology. Any sort of field course I could work into my curriculum, I tried to do. And I even remember in my undergraduate summers, I would appeal to the graduate professors that I could tag along so that I could learn sort of plant and animal associations and all that kind of stuff. So that ecology mind, my major professor in college sort of got me into that, and I really appreciated it and pursued it. It was something that not every undergraduate got the opportunity to do, but I was fortunate in that regard.
Before we go into how remarkable it must have felt to actually work for Hog Island, where did you go to college? Just out of curiosity.
I went to a small, at the time, state school in Pennsylvania. It's now a university called East Stroudsburg University. It's in the Delaware Water Gap. I think if you would talk to some of my friends back then, or even my professors, I probably spent a lot of time in the Delaware Water Gap, maybe a little bit more than in the classroom sometimes.
Well, I was going to say, what a great place to just study and learn about birds, right?
Yeah, it was awesome. I was fortunate to have Dr. Larry Ryman was prominent. He was an ornithologist who had come from the West Coast to the East and was at East Stroudsburg. And he was instrumental in returning osprey to Pennsylvania. So I had the opportunity to work with bald eagles, peregrine falcons, and osprey. And so that sort of track that I learned at Hawk Mountain with hawk migration continued through as an intern, and then through school. And every job I've had since then has been, everybody mistakes me for an ornithologist. I'm really an educator. I have my advanced degree is in education. You don't turn jobs down when they're offered to you,
So how remarkable was it to go back to Hog Island on staff? You forged this path of, I love the image of a spark intern. I think that's great.
I just thought of that. That was new.
That's really fantastic. Your dad must have just been really impressed and psyched that you got that. And you must have too. Did it feel otherworldly?
It did. Now, just to clarify, you said Hog Island, but I went back to Hawk Mountain first.
I'm sorry, Hawk Mountain. I knew that. Sorry.
Hog Island was a bit later in my career. Yeah, my father was quite proud. For me, I can't remember a discouraging word from my parents about my propensity to want to be outside and do the things that I did. I was a pretty good athlete in high school, but my idea of a date was to go to this nearby lake and look for birds. And so I didn't have many female companions, let's just say. So I was a bit eccentric, I guess, in my interests. But, I grew up in sort of dairy farm country, and we kids were certainly outdoors, whether we fished or hunted and all that sort of stuff. That had a strong imprint on me and my interests. And mom and dad were just supportive, whatever I wanted to do.
Well, there's worse things than to be thought of as an ornithologist, although I think educator is a pretty high title. How did you get to Maine? How did we get lucky enough to have you?
When I was at Hawk Mountain and I had gone back and become a regular staff member, I worked for 8 years there and I got the itch to go to grad school. And of course, Hawk Mountain, they were really supportive and actually would support me going to a grad school that had something to do with hawks or biology and all of that sort of stuff. But I had come across this literature on something called the Audubon Expedition Institute, which was run by National Audubon. And they traveled around the country by modified school bus in sort of little communities, 18 to 20 people on a modified school bus, cooked out and slept out every night, and went around the country meeting people, doing things. For me, I was like, whoa, that's just otherworldly. You never hear of a school that does that kind of thing. And so I chose to do that as my graduate work rather than go to a traditional school, which probably harkened back to that time at Delaware Water Gap when I spent more time outside than I did in my classrooms. So I'm sure that had something to do with it. I chose more of an alternative education path than a traditional one. Hawk Mountain, they retracted their offer to support my graduate work, but promised me that they would hire me back when I was done with grad school. But 1 year into it, I went back to them and said, you folks have been great to me, but I believe that it's time for me to move on and, well, for all of us to move on. And so the person that actually replaced me is still there. And she is one of the top raptor researchers in the world, really. So I had the pleasure of actually, before I left Hawk Mountain, of helping to train her. And we remain really good friends to this day. And Hawk Mountain has been good to me ever since. When I go back, they put out the red carpet. In fact, 1 year, their 75th anniversary, they contacted me and flew me back down to Pennsylvania for that celebration. And of course, I went as the first intern. So there was some recognition there. Anyway, long story short, the Audubon Expedition headquarters was in Connecticut at the time I went to it, but it moved eventually to Belfast, Maine. And I stuck with it after grad school. They hired me as a faculty member. I went on to become the director for a few years of that. And so that's how I ended up in Maine. My first summer as a graduate student was in Trescott, Maine. The Audubon Expedition had a sort of summer campus there. And so I spent a lot of time on Strait Bay and Cobscook Bay, and I just fell in love with Maine. It was awesome. And there were more birds than in Pennsylvania.
Were you then part of the expedition educators? Did you do that as well?
Yes. In my second year as a grad student, the powers that be at the expedition essentially hired me. Then I stayed on after graduating as a faculty member. I drove a school bus for 14 years around the country.
Wow.
And all those years, we would go to different bioregions, if you will. Like I spent time in the Four Corners area in the desert Southwest. I spent time in the Pacific Northwest. I've been to Newfoundland 6 times, where we would go in the fall semester. So my first few years there, I was sort of northern New England into Newfoundland for the fall semester, and then the deep southeast in the winter time, the spring semester. And then a few years into it, I went to the deserts. Basically, I wanted to see all of the different parts of the country. And so I got to work in the Southwest and in the Northwest. So, switching each semester would be in a different bioregion. And we'd have the students from all over the country who would come and, we'd form these sort of education communities and move about with our bus to all the different things that we wanted to experience. So I've been in the company of people who were cutting down, ancient trees in the Northwest, or shooting spotted owls, to, on the other side, people trying to save those things and working to conserve land and all that. And so this experiential college, if you will, it was so intriguing and so moving. To work with students in that kind of environment was like a spark bird every day, except it was a different experience working with people who were doing really cool things, people who were doing not so good things, but we all put our shoes on the same way. We are all human beings. And what are we going to make of this thing? It's not so much black and white, it's gray, right? And so finding common ground, I think, was, I look back on my time with the expedition. I spent 14 years with the expedition, and I sort of dub it as the traveling for hope. And it was this pathway around the country where, yes, we got into people who were destroying forests and doing all that sort of stuff, but we also learned about many people who were doing really, really good conservation work, and even up to radical people like Earth Firsters and things like that. So for a kid coming out of, a little cow pasture in Pennsylvania and traveling around the country and meeting the big world, it was eye-opening and inspirational. And there's not a day that doesn't go by where I have some sort of interaction, some sort of experience that harkens me back to my time on the bus with the various communities of people that I traveled with and people that I met. However that came to be, whatever made me choose that path, well, I give my folks a lot of credit for that. And then I guess I had the personal courage to go on an alternative versus a traditional path.
When you first started talking about this program, I was thinking what an extraordinary mix of birds that you would come across and have to learn about. And it didn't even occur to me that in the midst of that would also be an extraordinary mix of people, and just navigating that and understanding that and having a much bigger appreciation of not always being surrounded by all the same things all the time. My overarching comment with this is we would all be better off if we got outside of our bubble a little bit. And when you said you had the internal courage to do that, I think that's true. It's really hard to do that. But holy cow, what an experience you had.
Well, I remember the hook to that whole thing. I just thought of it now, was when I was reading material about the expedition, it said what they were about was to reverse the tradition of 95% of your time indoors, 5% outdoors. And this was exactly opposite. We were outside all the time. We slept out wherever we went, in whatever kind of weather we experienced. And our indoor time was inside this little cubicle of a bus. We had a seat. You didn't sit in the same seat, but underneath a seat somewhere on that bus, you had a little box, kind of like a carry-on on an airplane. It's tucked under your seat, and that's where you kept some stuff. And then overhead were shelves where you had your sleeping gear. And on top of the bus, on the roof rack, was my backpack with extra clothing and things like that in it. And so when you learn to live sort of minimally like that, it's, that too, that inside the dynamics of community and learning about the people you were traveling with and the experiences you were having, it was extremely powerful. I remember, I had to do some sort of experience for one of my grad courses. And I chose to go to a drug and alcohol rehab facility to study how nature might be involved in the recovery process. And this is the kind of thing that happened. So I went there, I spent 28 days. It was a 28-day program. And I spent all those days there. I got to be on both sides of the issue, sort of like participating as a client or a person there to recover, as well as on the staff side, I got to sit in on intake interviews and all these different things. Very, very powerful. And again, when I got done with that project, wrote up my report and submitted it, I got a call from that foundation, and they asked me if I wanted to come and work as an environmental psychologist. It was like, who does that? I had, in that study, I had realized that all of the people that I interviewed, they identified some sort of water source as part of their healing process. I went on to read about people in hospitals that are recovering from any kind of illness to surgery and all that sort of stuff. If you put a poster on the wall that has a picture of nature in it, people heal faster. If you give a person a room with a view out to the outdoors, they heal faster. If there's a water fountain or some sort of water source out in that thing, people heal even faster than they would just seeing a nature poster. I just was fascinated by all of that stuff that I learned during that experience. And when I brought that kind of information to the foundation who gave me this opportunity, they were just so intrigued. They wanted me to essentially be part of their staffs, and I would be prescribing what now is becoming more popular. I mean, some of it, the extreme stuff is forest bathing, but it's walks in nature, especially popular in Japan and Europe these days, catching on much more now here in North America. So not exactly birdie, but that more holistic nature experience is sort of how I think of my educational background. And birds are certainly the portal, providing me with all the opportunities that I've had. And so from the expedition experience, one of my students went and worked at Hog Island, Audubon Camp, and then came back after his experience and said, boy, they need a director down there. You ought to go be the director of that Hog Island place. And so essentially that's how I ended up there. So I spent 10 years as the director of Hog Island Audubon Camp. Again, people coming from all over the country and having a week-long experience in nature. Yes, there were bird-centric courses that we had, and those were the most popular, but we did all kinds of things. Botany, we did kayak, sort of nature experience stuff. And, I'm happy to say after departing there, that program continues to this day and is doing really well. They've really, really capitalized on the bird aspects of course offerings and things like that. And some of my colleagues from the expedition are faculty members. They come for a week and teach at Hog Island. And I myself am invited back every year to go back and teach there for a week now that I've left and gone to the Schoodic Institute.
That's just super cool.
It's all connected, and we don't burn our bridges. We keep in touch with our network of people. It's people. You cited that before, that the thread through all of this, yes, maybe birds, but people have been essential to my path for sure.
So that brings us to Schoodic, which is one of my longstanding favorite places in Maine that not enough people know about for a whole bunch of reasons, not least of which the extraordinary work that you all do there. Would you mind kind of explaining just this? You don't have to do a deep dive into Schoodic because Catherine Schmidt did that really well in a previous conversation.
She's awesome.
So people can go back and hear that one. But if you could talk a little bit about exactly what you're doing at Schoodic and the research and the education, give a little sliver into a part of science that I think people forget about, which is that the national parks are both an extraordinary research and extraordinarily important.
Again, to sort of put the thread through the needle, for the eye of the needle. During one of my summers with the Audubon expedition, I had gone to Acadia and applied to be an interpretive naturalist. And so that was in 1991. And I went there, I did my interpretive naturalist summer stint and thought to myself, I never want to go back and do that again. Because one of the days I had a geology hike and 66 people came to it. It was overwhelming. I couldn't manage that kind of a crowd on an interpretive hike. So I had some really, really cool things, interpretive programs that I did while I was a ranger, but some of those other things were really hard to take. And it just soured me to being an interpretive ranger. Though, again, I made a lot of connections and contacts while I was there. One of the things that I did while I was an interpretive ranger was going back, sort of thinking back to my past as a hawk watcher. And there was a professor at College of the Atlantic named Bill Drury who had done some bird work on the island. And one of the things that he did was the hawk watch. He experimented with monitoring hawks there. And so by the time I was leaving that summer stint, I wrote a proposal to the Park Service suggesting that they do a public hawk watch. Then I left. The next summer, from my summer experience, I worked with Project Puffin, and I got to work on a reintroducing terns to Stratton Island off of Prout's Neck down by Portland. So again, there was the education that one summer, the bird stuff the next summer. After I left Hog Island, I saw that there was a chance to return to the National Park Service because I kind of, had burned out at Hog Island and I wanted to get back into maybe interpretation, didn't know, I was sort of looking for things. And one of the people that was a classmate of mine as a first-time interpreter in 91 was a hiring person for a new interpretive position at Schoodic. Long story short, I got hired by that person and I worked with the Schoodic Education Adventure, which is the middle school residential program. So I was hired to bring citizen science experiences to that particular program. That was 2011. I also got to be an interpreter. So I worked with the school kids some of the time, but I also got to do general interpretation. And what I did was I set up a table out at Schoodic Point. I had different things and I called it Sea Watch. And whatever was happening out there in the water or even in the parking lot, I was there to talk to people about their experience in the national park. So somebody from the Institute, which of course was there as well, saw my work, liked my work, and they offered me a position to essentially move over from the park interpretive division to a full-timer at Schoodic Institute. That's what I did. I was given a fellowship to write a job description during one of the winters. And so I wrote the bird ecology program job description. It's based on monitoring migrations. Now, mind you, the Hawk Watch that I proposed but never got to implement, the park implemented it. The proposal was 91. They started the Hawk Watch in 94. I arrived on the scene in 2011. By 2012, I was brought boxes of hawk data and said, we need something to happen with this. It's just accumulating. So this coming fall will be the 28th year of the Hawk Watch, the hawk monitoring. That's the foundation of what I built the bird program description on. And we've extended it to tracking songbirds, tracking seabirds, all migration related. From that nucleus of monitoring migrations, we've sort of expanded out. And now I also do biodiversity monitoring, all of which have citizen science written into them. So I work a lot with volunteers that are interested in things like bugs, plants, birds. And so we have survey techniques, inventory work that I work with those folks essentially year round. So it's bird-centric monitoring bird migrations, as well as wintering populations and breeding populations. That's the nucleus of my work at Schoodic.
I'm going to make the assumption, and maybe I shouldn't, but you can correct me, that even in the 10 years that you've been doing this, and the less than 10 years that most of these programs have been going, you have seen an impact on the bird migrations as a result of climate change and the warming waters of the Gulf. Is that a correct assumption?
Yes, that's a very correct assumption. One of our studies is continuation of the Christmas bird count that's been going on a long time at Acadia National Park. There's two different count circles, one on the MDI side, one on the Schoodic side. And recently, colleagues and I have looked at the past 50 years of that data, which shows, depending on species, a 42 to 54% decline in population numbers. So that's our local studies. And if you accrete that to broader sort of continental studies, the same sort of thing is occurring. There was a study that came out in 2016, 17 that cited something like 3 billion birds. We're short 3 billion birds than we used to be in the 1960s. The trick is that everyday people that go out with, more and more people are birding. They're seeing the same sort of suite of species, right? But there's many less of each species, or the majority of species are many less. So where you might have gone out and seen dozens of chestnut-sided warblers in the proper habitat. Now you go out and and chestnut sideds are doing relatively well, but instead of seeing dozens, you're lucky if you see, a fourth of that when you go out. That would be an example of, the diminished population supply, so to speak. And so we're experiencing that across a lot of different forest birds, certainly neotropical migrants, far less than we used to see. A group of birds, a family of birds that are doing relatively okay are thought to be the ducks. And then there's differences within the duck categories. A Maine bird like the common eider used to be doing great, but we're finding that their populations are going down. And at the same time, with warming, some of our birds are expanding or moving northward. So their ranges are changing. In the 1950s, 1960s, you couldn't find a cardinal or a tufted titmouse in the state of Maine. Or if you did, you were quite lucky. But nowadays, those two species have come from the south and they're commonplace in some of our towns and areas. And as red-bellied woodpecker is another one. Carolina wren is another bird coming from the south. We're looking at things like that, where birds from the south are expanding their range. A bird like our state bird, the black-capped chickadee, is one that in predictive models says that if warming continues at the current rate of warming, or if it accelerates even more, in 30 to 50 to 80 years, black-capped chickadees won't be in the state of Maine anymore. So in the worst case scenarios, the swiftest warming or accelerated warming, that time frame diminishes, right? So it's more like 30 years versus an 80 year if we can somehow retard the rate of warming. And so there's birds like that are expanding. One of the birds that's already disappeared from Mount Desert Island is the boreal chickadees who used to breed on Mount Desert Island. And nowadays, in 91, when I was there as an interpreter, I wasn't the first one, but there was a boreal chickadee nest on a popular trail. And I go back to that same trail, same area every year to try to see that bird or its progeny. I haven't seen it since the 90s. And boreal chickadee sightings in the park are few and far between.
Are there bird species that you're more concerned about than others, adapting or being able to withstand climate change?
This goes along more of in an ecology mind, where the park is looking at refugia. So pockets of habitat that are likely to remain. I could have spoken also about the trees. The trees, like the birds, are expanding ranges and or disappearing because of invasives or insects that harm a population of trees, such as the emerald ash borer, if that gets here. There's already a red pine blight that's wiping out red pines in the park. And so the park is making sort of progressive decisions about whether they're going to try to stop some of this stuff or accept it or try to mitigate things, right? So all of that is going on sort of habitat wide. And the birds, of course, fall into habitats. So in this thing called refugia, where pockets of what we know of spruce fir forest and some of those kind of plants might remain longer than the general red spruce forest itself. Picture like maybe a little riparian ravine or something where colder temperatures hang on longer. And in those kinds of places, we would see black-throated green warblers hanging on. There's a handful of bird species that we associate with refugia that we're keeping more of an eye on and studying a little harder than some of the other species. But we're concerned with everything, and we're trying to monitor what is happening and where any sort of mitigation would be possible. That kind of data is what we at SCUDIC would share with the park, and then the park decision makers around management would make the sort of larger decisions. Where I'm working with the invasive plant crew, we're working over in Bass Harbor, where there was a novel study done on spruce warblers that share the niche of a spruce forest. And a guy named MacArthur did seminal studies way back when, and a current resource manager at the park has repeated that study recently. And we're looking at those species in a habitat that's been overrun with a invasive plant called glossy buckthorn. And so there, for instance, the management is taking an aggressive approach to removing glossy buckthorn. And one of my duties is to come in prior to treatment and during treatment and post-treatment to see what's happening with the bird and insect species that might be frequenting or not those particular treated areas.
So it's interesting. You have both a really granular role with the measurement, but also helping inform larger policy issues.
Yeah.
When you talked about refuge, it reminded me, I spoke with Jeremy Gabrielson of Maine Coast Heritage Trust. If I understand it correctly, their approach is to try to preserve ecosystems or refuges in much the same way. Long stretches so that there's a whole wildlife connected area, which makes me think, how much does the park and what you're doing, are you trying to also connect with other wildlife preserves so that there's a continuum beyond the park boundaries to allow for that kind of wildlife refuge?
Yeah. So the park has its boundaries and so forth. And not too long ago, a whole new section of park was added on the Schoodic side, which essentially doubled the park on the Schoodic side. But from Schoodic Point to Schoodic Mountain, we call it the Schoodic to Schoodic corridor. I think it's a 16-kilometer distance. I might have that wrong, but inside of that corridor are Frenchman's Bay Conservancy properties, Maine Coast Heritage Trust properties. And so we're trying to, weave together these various preserves. The state has some land in there as preserved land as well. And so that's an example of one of the corridors, even though it's not associated with the national park. But because we are part of the national park, it's sort of accreted in that regard. So a much bigger swath of habitat, if you will. The work that I'm doing and a recent grant proposal that I put in that included Maine Coast Heritage Trust was to develop an inventory system for their preserves where we might have, public would think of it as kind of like a SWAT team where maybe once or twice a season, we would go in and, there'd be people looking for insects, people looking for mushrooms, different plants, birds. And so this SWAT team would gather that data. And by doing that systematically in some sort of routine fashion through the year, we'd be learning about what might be changing. One of the things that we specifically be looking for is the intrusion of invasive species. So to be an early indicator for finding invasive species. And with current management priorities, you would make a decision about, are we going to try to stop this invasive species? Can we get a grip on this invasive species? Do we just work mitigatively, if that's a word, to try to retard its advance? Decision-making like that. But there, the network of partnerships becomes much more important. And certainly the park and park personnel are involved in those conversations, perhaps as a consultants or mentors to what they've experienced in the park proper to reach out to those different partner organizations and their facilities or their preserves. One of the projects that we did was we started a Down East phenology network. So at Schoodic, we developed some training models and some species to keep track of on different land trusts throughout the Down East region. And our idea was to train those folks up, get them situated, and the volunteers associated with those particular land trusts would carry on the work involved with that. So that's another project that's been going. And just to give an example, in 2016, one of our all taxa bio blitzes that we did, that's basically looking at anything we could find, including plants, invertebrates, intertidal species, all that sort of stuff. I started this project called Down East and Acadia. And anybody that goes out with an iPhone or a camera or a tablet and takes a photograph of a living organism and uploads it to iNaturalist, all of that data gets accumulated or goes into a repository that the Schoodic Institute is keeping its eyes on. So since 2016, we're over 110,000 observations have been submitted by anyone that happens to do that's connected to iNaturalist. So our collection catchment area, so to speak, is Hancock and Washington counties. And we're just starting the process of getting our data analyzers involved with looking at, okay, so we have these 6 or so years of data accumulation. What is it telling us about that? Meanwhile, the accumulation of data continues as people take those photographs and submit them to iNaturalist. That's how we sort of prescribe continuing to look at what is happening with biodiversity writ large in that bigger area. Not exactly certainly we're keeping an eye on corridors, but that bigger stretch of land.
I have 2 more questions for you. I want to be really cognizant of your time. Do you find that when you do these really cool birding classes that you lead, I know you have different lengths of time where you do it, that you end up, I would imagine you get both really experienced and really novice bird watchers. Do they become kind of an integral part of your citizen science team and just kind of catch the bug, so to speak, to really be part of the work of accumulating all this data that you can then begin the analysis for? Or is it a lot of one-off stuff?
Well, certainly we open up that invitation to anyone. What I'm finding is most of the people that come to my bird programs are on the novice to intermediate area. They tell me, well, we're not expert enough to contribute to eBird. Then my job becomes, oh, yes, you are. And here's how you can do it. And that sort of thing. So I become a coach or a cheerleader with respect to everybody can be a scientist. And you don't have to be an expert. All you have to do is use your eyes and ears and get out there and do observations, really, if you want to be part of the team. One of the measures of success that I proposed when I made the bird program proposal to the Institute was that, this bold prediction that I would be able to build the number of eBird checklists per year, not just me, but the number of people taking observations and the number of checklists and things coming in. And of course, that wasn't such a bold statement. I've watched this stuff grow across the country, and each area just needs a cheerleader. You have a person like Doug Hitchcock's down at Maine Audubon and some of his colleagues. And eBirding itself in the state has grown substantially. There's people like Rich McDonald and the Acadia Birding Festival that bring people together where they learn about these opportunities. And the sort of mycorrhizal network, if you will, of people is growing in that regard. And we're trying to do that with iNaturalist. So iNaturalist as a citizen science magnet or attraction device, you don't need expertise for any of this stuff, but you need less of it because you're basically going out and taking pictures of organisms. And then there's a community of people that help you identify those things. So that's the easiest to do. And that's where most of our people, or most of the people I come in contact with, they're more apt to join in an iNaturalist effort than they are, say, with eBird, because they have this perception that you need to know birds better than they already do. So we're basically teaching up, encouraging, and inviting people to join that movement. It's really the thing to be doing these days. Even though you step outside your door and you see a monarch butterfly, or you see a butterfly you don't know, but if you can get a nice picture of it and submit that, that becomes important information to what we're learning about what's happening with our world.
I'll make sure I include a link to iNaturalist and eBird in our show notes. All right,
Great.
my last question for you, which is completely unfair, so you do not have to answer if you don't want to, is do you have a favorite bird besides your spark bird?
I joke with people and I tell them that whatever bird I'm looking at is my favorite bird. And of course, that's like a cop-out. Yes, one of my favorite birds is the winter wren. And it's a tiny little troglodyte of a bird. It sneaks around plant roots, tree roots, muddy sort of stream side areas and things like that. But it's got this amazing voice. And it's got this really long, long song for such a little bird. The reason why it is one of my favorites is because way back in my Hog Island days, one of the instructors from Cornell was on my faculty group at Hog Island. And we went out in the forest with parabolic reflectors that gather the sound. He put headphones on me, pointed it towards a winter wren that was singing, and that bird voice came right through my body out, and it just filled me with this song. And ever since that moment, when I hear a winter wren, something tingles all through the senses of my body. And so I've loved winter wrens ever since. The other thing is that when you hear a bird sing, the trick is to go see the bird sing without intruding on the bird, if you will. I say to people, that's the apex of experience when you are hearing a warbler sing, but you see it sing at the same time. For me, when I was doing that growing up and people taught me to do that, sometimes I can revert back to my very first experience with a particular bird, and I'm reliving that original experience.
That seems like we'd all be better off if we could have that kind of experience.
It helps me to remember things for sure. From the beginning of my dad and his friend taking me around and counting rabbits and pheasants along the roadside to doing the monitoring work that I do now, I've had a career of privilege, really. Sometimes I suffer from the imposter syndrome where, the idea that people think I'm an ornithologist, but truly I'm more of an educator. That's the kind of experience people get from me when they're with me in the outside. I feel like my passion comes through and those labels fall away. And it's the experience that we have together that I love to share.
Well, Seth, this has just been a joy, and I have so enjoyed talking to you. I feel like I actually do want to. Schoodic Mountain is one of our favorite hikes.
Yeah.
So I want to go do that and actually pay more attention to the birds as opposed to the other stuff I usually pay attention to on that hike. I've really, really enjoyed this conversation. I am in awe of what you do and really impressed with the programming that you put and how you have both the granular and the 30,000 feet. That is not easy to do. So I appreciate that, and I appreciate what you're doing.
Thank you for the opportunity. And again, my pleasure. I hope I can continue to do it long into the future.
Me too.
Thanks for listening to the Maine Science Podcast. Make sure you never miss an episode by subscribing on your podcast platform of choice. And please leave a rating and review. It will help more people find us and help spread the word about some of the remarkable people doing science in Maine. The Maine Science Podcast is recorded at Discovery Studios at the Maine Discovery Museum in Bangor, Maine. The Maine Science Podcast is hosted by me, Kate Dickerson. This episode was edited and produced by Scott Loiselle. We received financial support from Central Maine Power, production support from Miranda Bouchard, and social media support from Next Media. The Discover Maine theme was composed and performed by Nick Parker.